Hi, I'm Tom Stevenson and welcome to Cost Control in Construction. Change orders. Measure once, cut twice. That is what change orders often feel like. It's really not supposed to go that way, but that's how change orders actually feel. In this lecture 6B, the second in this topic, we're going to be discussing change orders, and we're going to try to have a good understanding of how they impact our projects and some of the things that we need to consider with regards to protecting ourselves against potential losses as a result of change orders. Everybody has this sort of concept that, well, at least the private sector have this concept that contractors make a small fortune with change orders. I want to challenge that a little bit in our thinking because it is challenging to actually be profitable in change orders. You can be, and some companies are very good at it, but I would say the large portion actually end up losing money on change orders. And there's a lot of reasons behind it. So there's three categories of changes that we need to consider. There's owner directed, there's constructive, there's consequential cost of changes. So let's look at each one of these. So owner directed, that's probably the most common type of change order. It's not that bad. It means that the owner recognizes that this is a change. They tell the contractor to perform it, and they know that it differs from the original specifications. Sometimes the change could be a deletion, meaning that there's less work, or it could be that there is actually additional work. And it could also impact the construction sequencing and schedule, of course. So what we need to do is estimate all of the direct costs and indirect costs whenever possible, the consequential costs and time impact as well. Direct and indirect, that's a lot easier to kind of figure out than the consequential costs and time impact as well at the time of the change. These are very challenging areas here. And what do we mean by that? Well, we'll talk about that as well. In addition, the project manager needs to be able to prove to the owner that the costs and time involved in the change are fair and reasonable. As I said, there's a lack of trust, probably rightfully so, with a lot of owners. We have a large transportation industry, public transportation, that is very often very skeptical of changes. And I suspect a lot of that is rooted historically where maybe they were taken advantage of in some of the infrastructure projects. So they've developed a very, very sort of tight methodology requirement for contractors to be able to prove those costs. And as a result, it tends to protect them, but it also tends to cost a little bit more because contractors have to spend so much time proving that. So it's easier then to justify all these extra costs, administrative costs, and other consequential costs that come into play. But they have to be very good at it because nothing's going to slip through in those cases. So you really have to take an approach that if we have really good documentation in place, really accurate data as far as material costs, as far as labor costs, as far as our original plan, as far as how is the schedule impacted as a result of this, and you're able to track that and demonstrate that, you have a pretty good chance then of being able to recoup those costs and to go after a certain fair margin for your profit. Typically, a basis of dispute with the owner is constructive costs of changes. This is usually where the owner doesn't receive any additional benefit. So there can be a lot of things under this particular area. That somebody wasn't following the contract, or maybe there was somebody, a consultant that was overzealous that had kind of impossible inspection requirements. And so because of all this extra work, the contractor has implicated some claims and is seeking some change orders signed off. Or there was an erroneous interpretation of the contract information. So these are all areas where I'm the owner. I don't get any extra value out of this, so I don't see the positives to it, at least on the directive one, I'm typically asking for something more and I can see a benefit. Or if there was a design error or something along those lines, I don't necessarily see that. So that's really much more requires a lot of evidence and a lot of documentation, because you've got an owner, I don't want to pay for this. What am I getting out of this, right? And so you really have to have monitored the project very carefully and demonstrate how this is impacting the project and how this is costing you extra money, and be able to prove that. Otherwise, it ends up being a claim and an unresolved claim, and unresolved claims very often end up in litigation, which is generally negative for everybody, including the relationships that are involved in the project. So that is part of the aspect. So consequential changes. So this was constructive cost of changes. Consequential changes are well, we did this, but it impacted all these other things. And you can imagine that you're working on a project and you're in a good flow of work, and you've got your workers all going and everything is going along really well, and then boom, it gets interrupted. That's basically a consequential impact. It's not necessarily the change itself, but it's interrupting all of these other things that were flowing and moving so well. But now this trade can no longer continue, because if they do, it's going to interfere with whatever the change is requiring, and it'll have to be ripped out. That has an impact. Also, things where you have a delay, and maybe it's a serial delay, and so it causes this delay causes another delay, causes another delay. So where all of a sudden work that was going to be in good weather is now in -20 and snow. And it's exterior work, and then that's got to be all closed and it's got to be heated. Those are consequential changes and impacts. So you really have to be on the ball to monitor that. And this change itself doesn't look like that big a deal. It's just this thing. What do you mean all this other stuff? I don't get it if I'm the owner, right? But this is meaning the project's now delayed, it's got to be redesigned, and now this work's not going to happen for another 3 months, and now we're in the dead of winter. That's a consequential impact. So we really also have to think about change orders and our pricing. We can think about change order management, the process of pricing it. Sometimes we're in a big hurry for the price. So is it going to be a lump sum change order price? Is it going to be time and material or cost plus the change order pricing? A lot of that has to do with how urgent it is, meaning that, well, we've come across this, we've got to fix this right now. We're working on a price, but in the meantime, we're going to charge time and material or cost plus till we get the full price in for this. Those kind of aspects, how is it going to be priced, is important. Generally, you want to give a lump sum price for the change, but for certain components of it, you may have to do what we call a directive change or directed change. And change directive, where you're actually directed to go ahead with it even though you haven't got the final sign off on the change order, because the price is currently being worked out. So those are some aspects, because maybe some things have to have a final design done, but you can still proceed with some aspects of it before you hit the part where you need the final design. A lot of variability in the reasons and logic and requirements for a change order, but it's good to have good administrative understanding going into a project, the various ways that change orders will be handled under certain circumstances. And you really do need to think, as I was saying, like weather and how that can potentially impact the proceedings of a project and slow things down and interrupt the actual work. When we think about pre-construction activities, we do a lot of things in pre-construction. We spend a lot of time in pre-construction setting up a lot of work. That's the other thing. If somebody deletes something from the project, you've already spent a lot of preparatory work on it. So the amount of value that project has, well, if you're deleting that off the project, if you've invested a certain amount of time, and keep in mind, it could be weeks of work, then that has a value to it and there should be a claim made for it. Otherwise, again, you're not only losing that extra work, you're losing the value of the work that you put into it in the early stages of pre-construction. So you work along at this and you make sure that your field people are ready and you've sort of lined things up. So you've done your due diligence in pre-construction, and then that can be problematic later on. And when we think about change orders, as I was kind of alluding to earlier, the car industry is a good example of where you don't see changes in a production line. Like things are, a lot of effort went into setting up that production line. There may be tweaks and adjustments to quality issues on the production line, but it's not like individual clients are saying, I want the Harman Kardon speakers instead of the Bose speakers, and somebody stops the line and somebody runs out and they go get the Harman Kardon speakers and they come back with it and then the line starts up again. The costs associated with that would be enormous. All of that, there would be 1,000 workers disrupted for an hour at the hourly rate of $80. The total cost would be $80,000. And that's not even including late fees and deliveries of cars and maybe people wanting their money back from orders that aren't delivered. That ripple effect that would go out to suppliers. They're working in a just-in-time kind of industry. That would affect the supply chains, overtime to make up the production to try to catch up, losses incurred by the dealers, and then all the consequential damages for deficiencies, errors, and omissions. Like that's what the kind of ripple effect that happens in the automotive industry. And yet, construction industry still kind of works that way. That's what we kind of have experience. This is what we deal with. And do we not have those kind of disruptions? Do they not impact the whole project? Labor productivity, project stops, trade leaves the site. Do they come back when exactly we need them? If we actually disrupted their work, probably not, because they've started somewhere else. So that's even a further disruption, a further ripple effect. Does that not mean we're longer on the site as a result of that? Isn't there, as we've talked about, a per diem cost of every day you're on the site? So definitely, and do changes not cause errors and omissions? Think about a productivity home builder and somebody changes the granite countertop, and then somehow maybe our system mixes up the orders and they end up with the original color, or even worse, the original brick. Then that client is very upset. Now you've got this brick, which is the wrong brick on the house compared to the one that the change order was made to. So you get these kind of errors and omissions that occur as a result of an excessive amount of changes, because that you're opening yourself up, that there's more opportunities for mistakes. So that's another consequential effect that can occur as a result of a change order. So it creates confusion, decreases productivity, increased management costs. Now you're so busy with the changes and trying to handle their impacts kind of causes you to divert your attention, because very often when changes occur, it's not like we up the management on the project. We had a certain plan for that and a certain budget for that. And now you have basically clients that think, well, you're there anyways. It shouldn't be a big deal, the administrative side of it. You're not really doing that much anyways. You can take on this extra work, no problem, no cost. Not really reality very often, especially when the volume of changes can really escalate on some projects that are fast-tracked. There wasn't a complete design done. There's a lot of things that were missed, incomplete drawings, incomplete documents, design errors. These can all lead into some of those impacts that make it very difficult for you to be cost-effective on your project. So keep in mind these points here, as I was saying. You also have higher cost of materials that you're just picking things. You haven't had time to scale these things up. We talked about materials and deliveries. You're just trying to get these orders very quickly very often because these changes need to be done more quickly. Didn't really have time to effectively plan them, and you may have to have done some of the work out of sequence. The other thing that is very often not considered, but should be considered, is the lower productivity rates of trades when they work longer hours. Because very often when you fall behind on a project because of changes, what do? You work overtime, you work extra hours. And even if you price that into your change order, do you get 100% productivity out of that? What you usually would get in the normal circumstances. Well, I don't know about you, but I do know about me. When I work very long hours, I tend to make more mistakes. I'm not as sharp. On a construction site, you have a higher potential for accidents because people aren't as sharp. Think of yourself when you've worked a long day and towards the end of the day, maybe you're working 12-hour days. Well, maybe the first day you're not too bad, but as that goes on some projects and you're being asked to work longer and longer hours, you get less and less productive. So there's been a number of studies on productivity and historical studies, and these are very often used by some of the forensic consultants that you see. That a forensic consultant is like a claims consultant, and they can be hired by a contractor or they can be hired by an owner or client to go through the documentation. And very often they'll look at things like these studies to try to look at the drop in productivity. So as I said, in the first week, maybe not crazy amounts. If you're working 6 days a week, or 5 10-hour days, or 5 9-hour days. But as it goes on, and say 6 9-hour days, longer hours for longer periods of time, there is significant drop-offs. It gets to the point where you're actually not any more productive if you're working a 40-hour week, believe it or not, because the whole week you're tired compared to just working 40 hours and being pretty fresh. Not to mention all the social consequences, family, relationships, that can be crushed by that, and that distracts workers in their job as well. There's been a lot of research and study done in this particular area, so it's something that needs to be considered. And are you able to get an allowance, or in your actual design of your costing, that extra amount if you're planning to work extra hours? So if it's going to be for a long period of time, that's probably not the best way to go about it. If it's going to be for a long period of time, you might want to consider multiple shifts. But you also have to consider, with multiple shifts, the handoffs. So you have to have some overlap in the shifts. Overall you'll have better productivity, but you want to make sure you have good handoffs between the managers in those shifts, so that when one group finishes, the other group knows where they're taking up. Normally you finish and then you start the next day. Well, you know where you finished and you know about any changes or any requirements that came in. So that's not problematic, but you do need to think about that. So overtime impact on productivity, overtime goes down and your productivity rates go down. So keep that in mind when thinking about pricing and costing changes, if it's going to require extra overtime. If you're bringing in extra resources, and that probably won't be the issue, but sometimes it can be an issue, right? In the first example, our average productivity will be around 80%, meaning that although we are working 50 hours per week in lieu of 40, our effective work output does not increase. At 80% productivity, 50 labor hours will produce the same amount of work as 40 labor hours at 100% productivity. So in this example here, in the 5-day 10-hour chart, the average productivity drops from 98% the first week to 66% in the 16th week. The 7-day 12 hours chart shows 75% productivity the first week, down to some 36% in the 16th week. So it's just showing you different examples using sort of some of the data to get a perspective of how much you actually lose over a long period of time, and some of the significant differences. So 712 is pretty extreme. Most labor codes wouldn't permit that, but definitely you want to look at that, and you want to be careful about thinking, well, just extra hours is going to resolve the problem. Extra hours may help in the short term, but there is definitely a diminishing return at a certain point where you're actually not gaining that much. So that's to be considered in that process. So that's what I wanted to cover in this lecture. We'll be moving on in the next lecture, and we'll be furthering our discussion on the change order impacts. But keep in mind the different ways that it can be viewed and making sure that it represents the extra effort that you're taking. And if you're going to be able to recoup the costs of the changes, you have to be able to break it down. You have to be able to demonstrate how it delays the other aspects of the project. So if we're talking about consequential impacts, we have to be able to show that. No client is going to want to pay for anything extra than they have to unless you can really demonstrate it to them. And that's where it comes very helpful to have effective documentation, to have excellent baselines for a budget taken from your estimate, to have monitored and tracked the work so that you can demonstrate, well, look, especially on something where you got a lot of repetition, we were going at this rate till boom, this occurred. And once this occurred, then this is the rate we were achieving after that. Because mostly clients would like to say, well, you just estimated wrong. Your original estimate wasn't done well on this. So you want to be able to demonstrate the impacts that changes have on your projects. So I'm Tom Stevenson, wishing you a wonderful day, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye for now.